Good evening. Good evening. My name is Councilmember Tim Goodrich, and I'm very happy that you could join us here tonight for what is about to be, I think, an amazing presentation. Before I get started, I'd like to thank some people that helped to organize this event. First of all, our staff. I was here earlier as they were preparing the room, and you wouldn't believe how much actually goes into preparing a room for a presentation like this with the audio checks and all that, and I saw them working very hard for a couple of hours. So thank you to our city staff for setting up the room. Also, I'd like to thank our sponsors tonight. They are Congressmember Ted Lieu, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, State Senator Stephen Bradford, State Senator Ben Allen, State Assembly Member Al Maritsucci, County Supervisor Janice Hahn, the South Bay Association of Realtors, the Granger Company, the California Rental Association, CMTC, the Downtown Torrance Business Association, and Sayers Regis Development Company. And finally, I'd like to thank the volunteers that helped spread the word about this, whether it be you forwarding emails to your friends or the volunteers that went door to door with me in Old Torrance to distribute the flyers and help get the word out for this. So thank you very much. Let's give them all a round of applause. Next, a couple of ground rules. Those of you familiar with Torrance may have noticed we've had a little bit of drama at our council meetings lately. A number of disruptions, and unfortunately the civil discourse has taken a turn for the worse, so that necessitates the need for this brief statement. There's no filming. We found it to be very distracting to those around you. The room's going to be dark, and I'm going to be putting this video on YouTube anyway, so you can watch it 1,000 times afterwards if you'd like. Also, keep it civil. Maybe not all the opinions that are shared here tonight are going to be popular, but it's just that. They're opinions. They're information. Ultimately, this event is an educational event. This is an ideas event so that we can take what's worked in other places and use it as we desire to further Torrance and make Torrance even better. At the end of the day, Torrance is going to do what works for Torrance. So this is an educational event first and foremost. And this is also the very, very beginning of what is bound to be a multi-year process for Old Torrance. So I actually moved to Torrance originally because of Old Torrance. Old Torrance is very near and dear to my heart. I was driving around one day, had been living in Los Angeles, and I said, you know, this place feels like home. It's beautiful. And because of that, I moved here many years ago. And later I found out that the architect of Old Torrance, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., well, his father, Frederick Law Olmsted, designed a lot of the area in Buffalo, New York, where I grew up. So I'd like to think I saw that connection without even realizing it. And whatever we do with Old Torrance and revitalizing it, I think it's really important to maintain the character of the neighborhood because it really is a special place. This idea was born out of a campaign last year that I ran for re-election, and thank you to all the voters who re-elected me. And that campaign, I was talking about the need to bring tech businesses to the city of Torrance. I think that's really important for the future of our city for a number of reasons. First and foremost, technology is taking over the world. It's going to be the wave of the next 20 to 30 years, and if we can latch on to just a piece of that, I think that will make the city of Torrance well off during that time frame. Tax revenues, increased reputation, good workforce that we have here in the city, and so on. And after I got reelected, I started taking a look. What exactly can the city do? What is our best approach to attract those tech businesses? And we're actually very limited in what we can do. We're not private property owners. We don't own a lot of land, but we do have control over other things like zoning and incentives and things like that. So and through talking to a lot of different people, I came to realize that probably our best shot at attracting these businesses to the city of Torrance is to create a great living space for the people who work in those tech businesses. And those young people that predominantly work in tech businesses today They want a live, work, play type of area. And if you look across all of Torrance, 99% of it is not really live, work, play. You can't walk after work, your job from down the street. You can't then go further down the street and go to the restaurant. We're not that much of a walkable city, but Old Torrance is. So that fits really nicely. Also, the former Toyota campus, which is now vacant and owned by Serge Regis, their goal is to attract tech businesses to the city of Torrance. Just so happens that that's a mile down the street from Old Torrance, which happens to be very convenient. And then in terms of impact on a community, I think it pretty much goes without saying that if you create a live, work, play area, it's going to help with any traffic issues and things like that might arise from more people living there. So I think a lot of these issues really dovetail together, and today's young workforce is looking for a place like Old Torrance in which to live. So where are we now? The City Council, by unanimous vote several months ago, authorized money for a consultant to do an initial study and create a vision for Old Torrance, which hopefully will then lead to a specific plan. So that's where we are on that. Also, in working with our economic development manager and with a little guidance from the Alliance for Southern California Innovation, who you'll hear from later tonight, we have realized that we need to have a focus. You know the old adage, you can be good at many different things, but I think you're going to be more successful if you excel at just a couple. So we have a lot of technology business here in the city already. We have biotech, we have aerospace, we have environmental tech. So we're doing studies to see where our strong points are and see if it makes sense to continue pursuing those micro sectors to attract those types of companies to be here. So we're not just a hodgepodge of everything so that we can excel in one certain area. So identifying our strengths, basically. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd also like to recognize a couple of people that are here tonight. And normally we would do this in hierarchical order, but I just took the names as people were walking in tonight, and I am not that good at organizing 15 names on the fly, so I'm just going to go in order as they were written down here. First, we have Torrance Unified School District President Don Lee, and you can hold your applause. I'll just go through all the names, but Don's in the back there. We have the Chair of the Water Commission in Torrance, Jack Walzer. We have Commissioner for the Commission on Aging, Kay Grundhaus. We have Jimmy Gao, Commissioner from the Social Services Commission. We have Field Representative for Elmira Suchi, Andrew DeBlock, and Andrew is also a candidate for the southernmost city council district in the city for next year's election. And we have Representative for Senator Ben Allen, Olivia Webro. We have Councilmember Jeff Rizzo, and he's going to be running for election, I know, in the West District here next year, re-election. We have the Field Deputy for Supervisor Janice Hahn, Jennifer Lamarck. We have a council member from the City of Artesia, Melissa Ramoso. Council member from the City of Redondo Beach, Laura MD. We have from the Environmental Quality Commission, Jim Montgomery. And I saw a former elected in Sue Herbers, our former city clerk, and she's also a candidate for city council in the Old Torrance neighborhood for next year's election. And finally, some staff members I'd like to recognize because they're very involved in this process here. We have Assistant City Manager Ram Chaparian, Facilities Manager Shant Megardichian, and our Economic Development Manager Fran Fulton. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker tonight, Andy Wilson. Andy is a leader in the Southern California innovation ecosystem and has started, led, or invested in more than 24 tech startups. In addition to leading the Alliance for Southern California Innovation as Executive Director, he serves on the City Council for the City of Pasadena, and he is a founder of Innovate Pasadena, which is dedicated to advancing the east side of Los Angeles as a vibrant innovation center for deep tech. Previously, as founder of Momentum Ventures, an early-stage tech accelerator and venture fund, He personally led more than a half dozen SoCal tech startups and invested in almost a dozen others. He previously held senior executive roles such as President, SVP Product CIO, COO at Overture Vent Services, Yahoo, River One, Bone & Company, and R.R. Donnelly & Sons. He has extensive board experience in the nonprofit sector and community organizations such as Pacific Oaks College, Pasadena Heritage, and STEAM Coders. He is a regular speaker at entrepreneurs events and business schools and was named one of the 50 most innovative men in the San Gabriel Valley. Andy holds an engineering degree with honors from Dartmouth College and received his MBA with a concentration in operations and technology from Harvard Business School. Let's give him a warm Torrance welcome.
Tim, you're taller than me. So good evening. I'm Andy, and I'm mostly an entrepreneur. And a couple of years ago, I switched gears to being, really I'll call it public servant. So those who are elected officials, one way to give back to our community. But another way that's been very important is thinking about economic development. And I've focused my energy really in the area I know best, which is creating high-tech companies. And so my presentation tonight will have three pieces. One is what we're doing at the Alliance for Southern California Innovation, which is the not-for-profit I run, and it's really focused on leveling up the opportunity for Southern California essentially to rival Silicon Valley as a center of innovation. And I'll tell you why that's not as crazy as it sounds. Then I'll talk a little bit about the work that we're doing with a very prominent consulting group called the Boston Consulting Group. And they've helped us think about what strategies can we employ in communities to help them play a role in the larger Southern California innovation ecosystem. And the last thing I'll talk about is a case study of a project that I ran in Pasadena called Innovate Pasadena, and how that's helped transform at least old Pasadena, and I've just want to mention it, which is our retail district. As we've seen retail kind of ebb a little bit, thanks to folks like Amazon. The question that we contemplated is, what do we do to maintain vibrancy in our city? And pushing on innovation has been critically important for us. And I think at least it will be, I don't want to say a role model, but at least a strategy that you can see how that's worked. So those are the three things I'm going to talk about. So Southern California Alliance for Innovation, I want to flip this up a little bit so I don't have to turn around. It's really about putting the diversity of Southern California to work in order to optimize the conditions for innovators. Those are the people you want who start companies to bring breakthroughs to the world. And I'll tell you, I can tell people here in this room have been around the block in most cases and have seen great industries like aerospace come out of Southern California, and this tremendous amount of biotech. So we'll talk about those specific industries as well. So as I mentioned, we think Southern California is incredibly well positioned to be a hub of innovation across, frankly, globally. And when you think about Southern California right now, when you think about innovation, you maybe hear something called Silicon Beach. Has anyone heard of the word Silicon Beach? Right, that's kind of Santa Monica, Venice. It's all the consumer media stuff. They get all the attention. But we think there's as much going on outside of Silicon Beach that needs to be activated and celebrated. And collectively, that's the real opportunity of Southern California, right? You think about the incredible research universities. We have more research universities in Southern California than anywhere in the whole United States. We produce more STEM and engineering graduates than any place in the United States. We have more students in higher education than any place in the United States, over 1 million students in Southern California. More PhDs, more Nobel laureates. Come on, people. We need to put those pieces to work. And that's really the call to action we're talking about. How do we put those incredible building blocks to work? And we think, we're kind of bold. We think there's a way to do it. And every community can take a role in that. And time is important. So I can tell you as an entrepreneur, having a good idea is important, but having a good idea at the right time is really more important. And so if you follow the narrative around Silicon Valley, you hear there's some kind of cracks in that community. Things, lack of diversity, traffic, expensive, you can't afford talent, lack of loyalty. People are constantly moving around, so you're trying to build an enterprise, and the employees show up one day, and where are they the next day? They've taken a job somewhere else. So the opportunity for us is really putting those assets together and taking a little bit of advantage of, I think, some of the saturation and kind of the peak that's reached in Silicon Valley. So I mentioned BCG. They're a very, very prominent consulting firm. They did a big report on the innovation community in Southern California. And the good news is when you look at California collectively, we show up in somewhere, probably the top 3 in the United States. So number 1 is, no surprise, Silicon Valley. Number 2 is the greater metropolitan New York area. And we edge out slightly Boston area. And I'll tell you, I think that's pretty impressive. But when you look at the resources in Southern California, I can tell you we can do better. Like, as I like to say, we're going pretty fast because we have a V8 engine, but we're only using 4 cylinders. So imagine if we could use all 8 cylinders of Southern California. I think we certainly could give New York City a run for their money. Maybe someday Silicon Valley, we'll see. So anyway, this is a report. If you're so interested, I suggest you look at it. It's great analytics about why we're bullish around Southern California. So a couple observations from that report. I won't make you read all 20 pages of it. In what they determined about Southern California, and we know that because we live here every day, it's not one place. Right? When you go to New York or a Boston, it's very concentrated. In Southern California, it's really a kind of a network of communities. And in many ways, that's our challenge, right? I drove here from Pasadena, hour and 15 minutes. Thank you, Waze. Probably be longer if I hadn't used Waze. But, you know, that's a challenge. But I'd argue that each of those communities have an incredibly compelling story to tell and set of assets to be put together. So if we can understand what those stories are and those assets are, we can create what I call a mosaic of opportunity. And I think that will be part of my message to you tonight, is where do you fit in that mosaic of opportunity that defines Southern California? So actions we can take to bring this to life. Venture capital, those are the dollars you put into startups. So if you have a great idea, it takes some money to build prototypes and products. So accessing venture capital is one of those things we think about. Elevate ambitions. We have a lot of engineers who always try not to think, they avoid failure, but guess what entrepreneurs do? They're the most optimistic people in the world. So we need to think about what those ambitions are. Shoot for the moon, okay? So we need to get people to be a little bit more ambitious. This last one about promoting diversity. I actually held an event yesterday around innovation, diversity being the fuel of innovation. If we all think the same and look the same, we're all going to have the same ideas. And we know in Southern California, we're not all the same. And I think fundamentally that's the challenge in Silicon Valley. They've all kind of had this very kind of narrow view, and they have a very similar view of what the world is, and they solve problems in a very similar way. In Southern California, we're kind of unique individuals who look at the world from our own perspective, and we think that's a huge advantage, right? So take that diversity, embrace it, and use it part of our advantage. You'll see this idea of incubating tech nodes, thinking about Southern California as a set of communities or nodes. We'll talk about that more. Connecting those communities so we're a network, we're more than a sum of the part, and then talking about those capabilities I mentioned. So the goals for the SoCal Alliance is increasing startup density, that's the number of startups we have in Southern California, addressing some of those challenges. As I mentioned, the Southern California brand, we have a great brand, but what do people think? Hollywood and the beach, right? And if you're an engineer and you're building biotech products and you're building transportation and batteries, people don't think that happens in Southern California. So we need to change the narrative so people think about Southern California more broadly. Because I got to tell you, and I spent a lot of time visiting research universities and research centers, some of the most important work in science and technology happens in our own backyard, and most people don't think about it. And then finally, creating great startups, right? Those are where the jobs are. Those are where the millennials are. That's where they want to work. Those where high-paying jobs are. So I got to think about building those companies that can raise capital. This is a busy slide, but I'll just kind of tell you the 3 things that we're doing collectively at the Alliance, and I'm going to double-click or drill down into this, how do you activate your neighborhood. So that is strategy 1. We call this FIND, which is fueling innovation through neighborhood or node development. How do you drive innovation by creating activized, energized communities that work together around certain innovation themes? So that's kind of this neighborhood activation playbook, and I'm going to talk about that. Number 2 is injecting capital. If you're an innovator but you can't access capital, you're never going to build a great company. So how do we make capital available to entrepreneurs? So we're working on that. And then the last piece is connecting those leaders from those communities. So we have a partnership with the Milken Institute. You may be familiar with the Milken Institute. Their global conference is this week. So if you're in Beverly Hills, you'll see a lot of extra security and streets closed off because their global conference is happening there. So we think by building the network of innovation communities, injecting capital to great startups, and then connecting community leaders, we really can start closing that gap on New York as a great innovation center, and then have our sights on Silicon Valley. And why do this? Why do this? So if we can increase the amount of capital that flows to startups from 7% of what flows to Silicon Valley to a third, what happens? We create $30 billion in new funding, 200,000 direct jobs, 1 million indirect jobs in Southern California, and that equates to 2% in employment. So this is a way to create a lot of great jobs in our communities. And frankly, I don't know about you, but real estate in Pasadena is super expensive. We can't figure out how to get dollars into people that in our communities can afford to live here. We got a problem. So this is a great way to give people jobs. Okay, so I'm trying to keep track of my time here. Tim, if you keep track of time for me, that would be helpful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of, this is nice, right? We talked about the strategy of building innovation communities across Southern California. But how the heck do you do it? So I'm going to share a little bit of that magic. This is hot off the presses from the Boston Consulting Group, and I do have to give them a call out. They are considered one of the finest strategy firms in the world, and they have given my startup, not-for-profit, $2 million a year of free consulting. So you're going to get a piece of that tonight. So, as I mentioned, they identified these innovation communities across Southern California. And Torrance is part of what we call the South Bay Cluster. That includes Manhattan Beach, El Segundo, and Torrance. You can imagine, how do you work together, not just as a single place, but a place of connected communities. They've done lots of research, and I've shared this with Tim and your economic development staff, of what we think is unique in those communities. And Tim mentioned this, is if you're going to tell a compelling story, you need to feel and do the work to feel what is your authentic story? What is your compelling story? You can't be everything to everybody, so you have to kind of do that introspection. And we've tried to give some data to these communities so they have some guidance and some insights around what we think their story could be. This is the data behind it. I'm going to test you on this later. But we looked at what those assets were. Let me just kind of tell you the categories. So how many startups were occurring in those areas? Do you think that's an indicator of how vibrant those communities are? Number of students being educated totally in STEM categories, right? If you don't have the students in the population to do the work, it's going to be hard to kind of get the jobs there. Number of companies that are investing, how many investors are in those communities, number of corporations. That's kind of the critical ingredients you need. And once again, the goal of this slide is not really to help you analyze the data. It'll make it available to Tim, but it's a framework. It's a lens to understand where you stack up and what resources you have, okay? And when we went through those organizational models, we kind of ended up with 4 classifications of various communities. Mature nodes, right? Those are communities that are hot. Silicon Beach, San Diego. If anyone in the biotech world, you go to San Diego and La Jolla, I mean, they're just pumping out biotech solutions left and right. West LA, kind of connected to Silicon Beach. Those areas that are up and coming. Pasadena, we're part of that work. Downtown LA, South Bay's in that category. Some are talent anchors. Santa Barbara, UCSB, Riverside, incredible cities with great talent production and research, but maybe missing some of the other ingredients. In the 4th category, we're corporate anchors. So you go down to Irvine, it really doesn't feel like innovation community, but you see a lot of headquarters down there. Thousand Oaks in the biotech area with Amgen. Burbank and Glendale, I'm actually speaking at their economic summit, Tim, in 2 weeks on a similar topic. They have a lot of it, Warner Brothers, Disney. So doing that inventory of where we are and what stage they're in. And when we thought about activation strategies, how do you bring these communities to life? The most important person in building innovation communities is whom? The entrepreneur, right? The person who builds the business. And so what strategies can we employ as communities that allow those people who are going on a journey. Has anyone here ever started a company? Any entrepreneurs in this group? Yeah, we'll be successful when this room is half filled up with entrepreneurs, Tim. Well, you know what it's like. It's tough to build a company, right? And if we can kind of make that path a little bit more, a little easier, take some of the friction out, that will allow your community to create more entrepreneurs. So that was the lens that the Boston Consulting Group used to understand what can we do as a community to attract entrepreneurs and allow them to create successful companies. Because if they get here and they set up shop and they fail, that ain't going to get us where we need to be. And so when they looked at those frictions, the challenges you see as an entrepreneur, accessing capital, whether that be from a bank or a venture capitalist, talent, can I get the people to work in my firm that have the skills? One of the other things, if you started a company, it can be pretty lonely. Like when you work in a big company, you have a lot of peers, but when you're out there working on your own, it's pretty daunting. And that's particularly true in Southern California, given how distributed we are. Navigation, and I mean that in every sense of the word, of getting around, what are the resources, who's doing what, and then kind of just the psychology of starting a company. So those are things that when we interviewed, and they interviewed 100 entrepreneurs, they talked about those challenges. And so, once again, this is a little bit of an eye chart, but the point of this is when BCG went through that journey, they went out and said, what are the things that you can do as a community to make that journey easier? And they came up with 32 things you can do, okay? Think about this as a recipe book. And the goal is not tonight to go through the recipes, but to allow you to understand that there are things that we can do as communities to, first of all, identify where we fit in that entrepreneurial ecosystem, and then help entrepreneurs be successful. Because if we want great technology companies, we need to be very affirmative and intentional around allowing that to happen. And the last thing I'll tell you is, we'll drill down into a case study around what happened in Pasadena. You have to have champions who not just Tim, but people in your community who care about the future of your community. As an elected official, this stuff is too important to leave to elected officials. Right? This is your community. These are the people who are going to keep your community vibrant. These are the people who are going to work in your community. So I challenge people who are stakeholders in that conversation to collaborate with your electeds and help architect that future and get involved. So become a champion and start owning that narrative. I got to tell you that we've watched this effort unroll and unfold in other places, and I shared this with Tim and the staff. If it's driven by the electeds, it's not authentic with entrepreneurs in startup community, because they know that they're electeds, and you need to have entrepreneurs who can relate to that story, or people who have built businesses to help support them. So this is a call for champions if you decide to go this direction. Okay, so we talked about the big picture of Innovate Pasadena in Southern California. We talked about strategies, and I thought I'd spend, how much time do I have left, Tim? 10 minutes, perfect. A little bit about Innovate Pasadena. And I'll tell you, this is a personal story. As Tim mentioned in my introduction, I've started a half dozen companies. And I was in the investment business for a while. And if you're in the investment business, you're not really heads down in building a startup. And then I got back into just building a startup, and I was in Pasadena, and I felt like I was in an isolated island. It was an isolated island trying to build a company, and I had no peer group, I had no community, and it was very frustrating. And frankly, discouraging. And so what did I do? Where did I know where the startup community was? It was in Silicon Beach. Try commuting to Silicon Beach, Santa Monica, from Pasadena. That's even more discouraging. So I remember, and this was now 6 years ago, driving back on that 10 freeway, and thinking about why those people, I had a kind of an expletive in front of it, why those people in Pasadena can't get their act together and really kind of create a community for entrepreneurs like me. And at the time I was 45 years old, and at 45 you realize, guess what? You are those people. So I nominated myself to be the catalyst to trying to get our community back together. So I'm going to share a little bit with that story and kind of what we did and what the outcome has been. If you do something here, I assure you it won't be the same, but a lot of the themes and strategies will carry through. So first of all, we started thinking about what is our story in Pasadena? What story are we going to tell? So you got to do an inventory of what you have to offer. And hopefully some people have been to Pasadena. It's a pretty nerdy place. I fit in very well. Lots of universities, Nobel laureates, art center. I mean, it's a very kind of academic, intellectually nerdy place. And we're like, that you know, depending on who you are, that could be really uncool, or we can make it cool. So we're like, we're going to make it cool. We're going to get a place where the nerds can come out and build companies. And so a lot of amazing stuff's come out of there, right? That's a rover, DNA sequencer, CMOS, Richter scale. I mean, like, so we're thinking about ourselves as kind of nerdy innovation. We're looking for our story. And I think the challenge here, you know, for your project in front of you is, what is your story? Right? Ask yourself what your story is. Then we said, hey, this is a great place to live and build companies. And you have the old Pasadena, and we're building housing, and we have the Gold Line going through there. We have 5 Gold Line stops, which is great for transit, bad for homeless. That's a whole nother topic. So a lot of interesting things going on. So we launched Innovate Pasadena. In the mission, and we got, by the way, I could tell this to Tim, we got a $5,000 grant to help us hire a facilitator to figure out what we were going to do to build our innovation community. So I got 7 other entrepreneurs I knew. I met with the president of Caltech. He assigned someone from his staff. I met the president of Art Center. He hired someone from his staff. The economic development manager was in that conversation. So we built a little working group. And this is our mission. It came out. Our mission is to advance Greater Pasadena as a center of technology and design innovation by supporting collaboration across and within businesses, academia, and the broader community in order to attract, retain companies, entrepreneurs, innovators, and capital. Right? And that was what we were like. That was our mission. And so what happened? So we were formed in 2013, so just almost 6 years ago. And today we now have 160 corporate partners. We have a lot of collaborators. It was about creating connections with a shared mission. Right? You can't do this on your own, so you got to think about who the collaborators are. So it's a 501c3 organization. We are the economic development director of the city, sits on it. 27 board members. You know you're successful and you don't have to be on the board anymore, and it runs itself, so I feel very proud of that. We have 3 full-time staff people. The budget's between $300,000 and $400,000 a year. So in what they do, what does Innovate Pasadena do? We have the resources, but we didn't have the community. Right? You feel like it's like making a cake. You can have all the ingredients on the table, but you got to put it together. And we felt that connectivity in the community was missing. And for nerdy people, if you tell them we're going to go out and get connected, guess what they do? They run back in the lab and lock the door. So we said, we're going to use education as a way to get people out. Because when you're nerdy people, you love to get educated. So we basically disguise community building events as education. Okay? And it worked. Because we build networking, because they actually don't mind networking, but if you tell them you need to go networking, they kind of devalue that. But you say, hey, you're going to learn about, you know, how to do online marketing using the best tools in the world. And like, oh, I'll go to that. So you have to be, you need to understand your audience, right? And we knew that the community was missing. So we help connect people, community, and capital. So Innovate Pasadena has played a very important role in fostering that community. So far in the 5.5 years we've been running, we've connected 80,000 people in that part of Los Angeles, okay? And that's nice, but what does it really mean? So I kind of put some metrics together in terms of outcomes. So, are you familiar with the idea of co-working spaces? That's a place where innovators get together. It's not the traditional Cube Farm or Dilbert kind of cartoon. It's a place where creatives get together and innovate. When we started Innovate Pasadena, we had 0 co-working spaces. None. We now have 5 co-working companies in over 100,000 square feet co-working space that house 2,000 people. Right? And so it's attracted a group of people who maybe would be going to Hollywood or Santa Monica. So getting co-working was a missing part. And I remember when we started this, I called the WeWork folks and cross campus and said, you should come to Pasadena and set up co-working. And they said, where's Pasadena? So when they got out there, now they're all there. And I can tell you, I just pulled, my friend runs cross campus, 97% occupancy. Okay? They just didn't know. We had to get our message out. I mentioned the other important part for startups is capital. We had Pasadena Angels was the only capital source in Pasadena. That's a network of high net worth people who put relatively small checks into startup companies. We had no organized venture capitalists in Pasadena. Now there are 6 venture capitalists 5 years later, and they're managing more than $300 million going into startup companies. right? So by creating this community and getting the people that we needed to participate, it was kind of like the honey to, to the bees, right? So these are the things that showed up. And last metric I'll show you, it's a little bit wonky slide from Boston Consulting Group, but the amount of funding, we were getting 6 companies funded from venture capitalists, and now we're getting close to 20. So the number of institutionally funded high growth tech companies coming out of Pasadena has increased threefold. Okay, and $150 million of capital has gone to work. So that's kind of the startup world. I can also tell you that a half dozen large corporations have set up their innovation centers in Pasadena. People like ADP. Tahini Eye Institute just moved out of downtown Los Angeles to be in Pasadena. Right, that's 120,000 square feet, 600 people. Kaiser Med School, the Kaiser Permanente system, is building their first med school in Pasadena. I can tell you, if we didn't tell them this is a place where innovation happens, those companies wouldn't be there. Right, so my last words of wisdom. See, I'm just about perfectly timed. Sometimes luck works in your favor. So be reflective and honest and find your story. Right, find your story. The data helps you find your story, but the people who live in your community, you know your story. It's just bringing it out. And then ask yourself, is that a story that you think others care about? Right, is that going to? You got to be excited by your own story first. Right, you ever have someone tell a speech, or my kids are like rehearsing a speech, and I'm like, stop reading the speech. You don't really care about this topic, and they say, yes, I don't care about the topic, and they get a C. But if you find a topic that you love and you care about, you get an A. So find your A topic. That authenticity is super important, and think about who else cares about that story, right? And this is how you create innovation communities. And I know Jeff's going to talk about kind of the physical aspect of that community that allows that to happen. Leaders, diverse leaders. We talked about this. This is too important to be left to city staff and just your electeds. If you care about your community and you're here to stay, take a role in building your community for the future, right? What do we have to offer that's going to make the next generation is proud to live in this community as you have been? And then kind of, I say fake it before you make it. Once you start seeing that, start telling your story and see how it works. And it becomes contagious. And define success. What are you trying to do? Build more companies, build jobs, build more housing. So this is about finding your story. The rest is kind of tactics. And first, most important step is deciding this as a priority and having the conversations and seeing if it builds kind of momentum on its own. So with that, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Andy. I couldn't help but notice every time he said millennial, he was looking over towards me, but I got to tell you that I was born 2 years before the official cutoff of millennial, so I'm not technically a millennial, okay? I did notice a couple other people in the room here tonight that bear announcing, and Mayor Patrick Fury is in the room with us. Planning Commissioner Rick Marshall, and just 2 weeks ago, we appointed a new Director of Community Development, and Danny Santana has joined us tonight. So if you're wondering about question and answers, yes, we are going to have a question and answer opportunity for the audience here. The way this works is we've got a couple volunteers in the room, if they could stand up. And if you're interested in asking any questions, just raise your hand and they'll come by with index cards and a pencil. You can write your question on there, and we're going to do a little round table up on the stage here after Jeff finishes his speech, and we're going to go through some of those questions. Next up is Jeff Speck. He's the principal of Speck Associates, LLC. If book sales and video views are any indication, Jeff Speck may be the most listened to city planner in the world. Suburban Nation, which Mr. Speck co-wrote with Andres Juane and Elizabeth Plater-Zerbeck, was the best-selling planning title of the 2000s. His award-winning book, Walkable City, published in 2012, has been the dominant planning title of this decade. and his TED Talks and YouTube videos have been viewed more than 3.8 million times. Formerly Director of Design at the National Endowment for the Arts, Mr. Speck leads Speck Associates, a boutique planning firm based in Boston. His new book, Walkable City Rules, 101 Steps to Making Better Places, was released late last year and is selling briskly. Please give a warm Torrance welcome to Jeff Speck.
Let you do the hard part. Thank you, everybody. I'll lean in on Tim while he does this. Thank you all for coming. It's just really nice to see such a big crowd. Thank you for letting me say things about your gem of a city, which I've never been to before, but I'm really glad that I'm getting to know. Thank you, Tim, for inviting me. I'm here because of one person, and that's Tim. If you like what I say, you can thank him. If you don't like what I say, you can blame him. But actually, he hasn't in any way told me what to say or suggested what I might say. We've defined slideshow from beginning. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. So I'm from the East Coast. I don't, as you'll learn more, I'm from Boston, like the Boston Consulting Group, where I almost worked after college. And I don't really understand California very well. That will probably become clear. However, the issues I'm going to be talking to you about tonight are fairly universal, and so let's get right into it. Most of my talks are about the Walkable City, which is the title of my last book. I give talks about why we need it and about how to do it. You are not getting the why we need it talk. I think that I just don't have enough time to do both, and I want to leave behind as much physical advice as I can give you tonight. But I don't think that this audience really needs to hear that. Let me just say that there are obviously very powerful environmental reasons why we need to live a more walkable quality of life. There are perhaps unsurprising epidemiological reasons where the doctors are telling us that it's this auto-dependent lifestyle that we've created in the car zone. That's the reason why we have the first generation of Americans who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents, because we just aren't getting exercise moving around anymore. And then, of course, there's very powerful economic reasons to be more walkable. And they run quite a gamut, but I think the one that Tim has been focused on and that most people seem to focus on in the communities I visit is they want to attract talent. And talent is mobile. Talent can go where it wants to be. And the strongest economic development strategies these days are becoming a place where people want to be. Then the talent comes, then the jobs come, and everything else follows. So you're not getting that talk, but I wanted to direct you to TED.com, where you can find that talk. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the reasons to be more walkable, please do that. Let's talk about how to do it. And how to do it is what I call, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, my general theory of walkability. And the general theory of walkability is the structure of my book, Walkable City, and it's actually the structure of my talk tonight, from start to finish, with a lot of little things thrown in about Torrance. So if we ask the question, how do we get people to walk, which is another way of saying, you know, how do we create a community in which the walking lifestyle is possible, which I would define as saying you can own a car. If you have a car, it's convenient to use it, but you don't have the mandatory prosthetic device of a car to live your life, right? The car is an optional instrument of freedom and not a required tool for living your life. If we're going to achieve that, then the environment needs to be one in which people make the choice to walk. And in America, in which most of us do own cars, and the car is sitting there in the driveway between you and everything, and you don't pay anything near the full cost of driving. You pay actually a fraction of the cost of driving. Society is paying most of those costs, particularly the indirect costs, like pollution. And actually, 4/5 of the cost of having the car is just owning the car, and only 1/5 is driving the car. So the fixed costs are huge, the marginal costs are very small. The smart thing to do if you have a car is to drive it as much as possible. So in these circumstances, how do you convince people then to not drive when they could, when many of them could? And the answer is that the walk has to do 4 things simultaneously for it to be chosen instead of the drive. The walk has to be useful, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and it has to be interesting. So what are those 4 things? And I'm going to take you through them one by one, and when we get to the end, my talk will be done. So the reason to walk is about mixed use. It's about having a proper mix of uses. And it's a story I learned from my mentors, Andres Dwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who founded the New Urbanism movement many years ago. And Andres used to give this talk called The Story of Planning. And he talked about how back in the 19th century, people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills. And the planners, who weren't yet called planners, said, hey, why don't we move the housing away from the factories? And when they did, lifestyles, life expectancy, lifespans increased immediately and dramatically. And the planners were all hailed as heroes. And they, been trying to repeat that experience ever since. So you have the onset of what's called Euclidean zoning, the separation of the landscape into large areas of only single use, where housing is separated from, high-density housing is separated from low-density housing, and office is separated from medical office, and every use is separated and gets a large piece of property. And this, as a starting point, means that walkability isn't possible, because the other uses that you might walk to are simply too far away. So, I was a art history major, which they say isn't a very lucrative major, but I can tell you that you don't want a Rothko when it comes to planning. You want a Seurat. And Seurat was the pointillist, right? And the places in America that are technically the most walkable are the places that have the finest grain of use, the most confetti-like mix of uses like you find in Manhattan, which, whether you enjoy walking around it or not, is actually the place where people do walk the most in the U.S. And this discussion of combination of uses gets into the fundamental new urbanist argument, which is the first talk I ever heard from Andres, who I showed you, my mentor. And he made the point that's always stuck with me, and it was the theme of our book, Suburban Nation, that there's only 2 tested ways to build communities throughout history and around the world. Like there's 1,000 ways to make a city, but there's only 2 ways that we've tested by the thousands. And one is the traditional neighborhood, and the other is suburban sprawl, right? You know both. The traditional neighborhood, this one happens to be Newburyport, Mass, near where I live. It's defined as being compact, as being diverse, and being walkable. It's compact in that almost all neighborhoods are about a 5-minute walk from edge to center, almost everywhere you go. You see in this image places to live, bigger houses, smaller houses, places to work, right? Mill buildings, places to worship. There's a main street back there for shopping, places to recreate, all together. And then it's walkable for a lot of reasons I'll get into, but mostly because there's lots of streets. And so each street can be small, because no one street is handling all that much traffic. Sprawl, by comparison, by the way, the traditional neighborhood evolved naturally in response to man's needs. The sprawl was an invention after the war, celebrating this new wonderful tool of the automobile. Clearly not diverse, right? The whole square mile can hold just one use. It's not compact, thus the name sprawl. And what's fascinating is there's lots of streets, but look how many of them are just loops and cul-de-sacs, right? Very few of them actually go through. The ones that go through, you'll notice they don't even have addresses on them, right? The houses have turned their backs to them because they're essentially automotive sewers, right? They have the obligation of handling all the traffic of the whole community, these few thick streets. And so you might be perfectly safe in your little cul-de-sac. However, you can't leave the cul-de-sac. And that's why children become more dependent on their parents, etc. So it's fun to break sprawl down into its constituent parts, the places where you only live, where you only work, where you only shop. Schools and other institutional buildings get supersized, and the size of the parking lot related to the size of this South Florida school tells you all you need to know about this school, which is that no child has ever walked to it or will. And then even the athletic facilities. When you begin with the presumption of universal automotive use, then you make certain decisions that you wouldn't make otherwise that then bind you into that lifestyle. So, Weston, also in South Florida, is very proud of its 8 baseball diamonds and 8 soccer fields and 8 tennis courts. But actually, I don't have a laser pointer, but a child that lives in that house across the canal actually has a 1.5-mile drive to get to the field because everything's been so carefully separated from everything else. And if you separate everything from everything else, you're famous, I think this is probably somewhere around here. All my best highway pictures are from LA. If you separate everything from everything else and you reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then your highway system, which initially was conceived as a tool for recreation and for commerce, becomes a commuting way. And that's what we have in so many places. So, for many people, this is still the American dream. The house that's just with other houses. But I always tell people it's a two-part deal. You can't have one without the other. When you isolate and separate, you need to drive. And the amount that we invest in our, this is in Massachusetts, I can't blame you for this one, the amount that we invest in our horizontal infrastructure so that you never have to wait more than 1 cycle at a light, right? Because the environment is so banal and mind-numbing that if you have to wait 2 cycles at a light, you just want to kill yourself. So we can't let that happen. So we spend all our national fortune on these streets, and of course the experience is no fun. This is not Photoshop. But driving can be a total drag, and being a pedestrian can be worse. So this is a slide I got from a doctor, from an epidemiologist. And I mean, this has been making the rounds for 20 years, but I always use it because it tells the story that I learned from the epidemiologist, which is that, if it's normal to drive, to park, to take the escalator, to the gym, to get on the treadmill, to walk, then there's something fundamentally wrong with the way you've organized your society. And this is why the doctors are telling us that sprawl is the reason, as much as diet, that sprawl is the reason that we have a moribund society. So if you remember no other image from my talk tonight, this is probably the most important one theoretically, which is you have sprawl on the left and the traditional neighborhood on the right. And it's the same stuff. This slide, I haven't changed it out. I should, because I'm going to see if I can pull it. No, I don't want to. Forget it. I'll be fine. It's the same stuff. This slide actually doesn't show housing, which of course it very well should. Housing would be is a big part of this landscape. But essentially, it isn't what's in your city. It's how big is it? How far apart from each other are the different parts? And then do you have? Remember I mentioned earlier the road system. Do you have on the left what's called a dendritic, a branching system, where every drive is from the cul-de-sac to the local, to the collector, to the arterial, to the highway, and back again, and there's only one path from anywhere to anywhere else? Or do you have a network, a nice porous network of blocks that you find in downtown Torrance? Because actually the whole system that was designed around the automobile, right, it was designed to be better for cars, it completely shuts down if you have so much as one engine fire on that collector road, right? So it's actually not a resilient system. And then you look at Torrance and you see in this image, right, the east edge of the heart of downtown, and you see the two models right next to each other. So you have the traditional block structure on the west with shops and workplaces and housing, and then to the right you actually have this. It's not as clear, it's not as ruthless as in my diagram, but you have these large blocks of single use that actually form a barrier between everything to the east in terms of walkability and the heart of your downtown. That's when you're making new places, that's the fundamental discussion regarding the useful walk, right? But what about when you have an existing place? And when you look at a downtown, you want the best balance of uses. And so you ask this question: what of all your uses is missing, perhaps, or is underrepresented in the downtown? And in most American downtowns, it is housing. You have more than some cities, but you have less housing than you have shopping, than you have workplace, and everything else in the heart of your city. When you bring the housing back, that's when everything else kicks into high gear. Jane Jacobs was talking about Wall Street in the early 1960s, where it had like 200,000 workers every day. And she said, Wall Street was very different then. There wasn't a single good restaurant or a single good gym. She said, to have a good restaurant, you need a lunchtime crowd and a nighttime crowd. Right? To be a great gym, you need a lunchtime crowd and a nighttime crowd. So that time spread, as she called it, is what allows places to really thrive and kick into high gear. And that's why cities, to become more lively and successful, are focusing on investing in housing in their downtowns. And then, of course, you have a ton of workplace right next to your downtown. But I'm not feeling like many of these people are walking downtown at lunch. And that's a function of the design of the streetscape, which we'll be getting into. But looking at the heart of your downtown, it's principally one-story retail, right? There's some nice multi-story stuff, but most of the environment around the traditional streets in your downtown core, where that traditional organization allows walkability to happen, are single-story buildings that don't have residential upstairs. And I'm reminded of a plan we did. It was actually the very first plan I did when I joined DPZ that I worked on in 1993. Was for downtown Naples, 5th Avenue South, Naples in Florida. And that was the situation. It was one of these, it was very sleepy, and the stores were all one story. And we had color photography then. I don't know why these pictures are black and white. But we actually created a plan that brought in upper stories of residential, above the shops. And now that street looks like this. And it's completely come back to life, in large part due to that mixed use. But cities understand this. One of my clients, Des Moines, has had, as recently as 2000, they had only 2,500 units of housing downtown. And by 2020, they'll have 10,000 units of housing downtown. And they did it by paying for it. They basically gave developers a 10-year tax abatement for the increased property value if they were to bring housing downtown, plus in many of those cases, 10 more years of tax increment financing. So the city understands that the downtown coming back to life will eventually accrue back to the city in increased sales tax revenue, et cetera, right? So they're investing, and many American cities now are investing in bringing more housing to their downtowns. So that's an important discussion. Also in the use discussion, as we finish up this first category, parking is really important. This is a slide that may not be as relevant here as in some of the other places I work. There seems to be a perception that actually your downtown at many times kind of doesn't have any parking spaces in it, even if you walk a block. And I'm not going to talk about parking tonight because it would take the whole rest of the night. But I am aware it's an issue, and I do think you're ready. I'm not going to say you have to charge money for it or anything else, but that it's time for you to have a parking study. But first, you should have another lecturer. Who knows who this is? Don Shoup. The world expert on parking is in LA, and we all worship at his altar, and he's a few miles from you. He wrote this book, The High Cost of Free Parking. And he's the next guy that you should have talked, that should talk here, because he's the one who actually brought Old Town Pasadena back to life. And he did it by charging the right amount for parking and having a parking plan. I don't know what the right answer is for you regarding parking, but it's clear that it's a critical reactant in the chemical equation that's going to bring your downtown back to life. It's very hard right now to invest in more parking when everyone's telling us it's going to go away with Lyft and Uber and autonomy. So it's a tough time to be making these decisions, but you need a real parking expert to help you. So that was the first category, the reason to walk. The safe walk is where we're going to spend most of our time. The last two categories are quite quick. But this is where it really matters, because if you don't feel safe, you're not going to walk. And also, it's the thing that the city controls the best. The city owns the streets, and you're fortunate that none of your downtown streets are state highways, like many places I work in where they're just overrun by the state, and that's not your situation in the heart of your downtown. But the city, with limited investment in a short time, can really change this category very quickly. So what are some of the things that add up to a walk being safer? They basically all contribute to friction. And a lot of things that, in fact, might make you think that a street is less safe, if it makes you think that, it's probably making the streets safer because now you're not speeding. And what are those things then that cause cars to go a little more slowly than a little more quickly? And by the way, a car going 35 miles an hour is 7 times as likely to kill you as a car going 25 miles an hour. So that 10-mile-an-hour span from 25 to 35 is absolutely key in creating a safe city. The first thing is block size. Smaller blocks make safer cities. This is Portland, Oregon, famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks. This is Salt Lake City, famously not so walkable, famously 600-foot blocks. Here they are side by side. It's amazing. These were built at about the same time, not too far from each other, but just an entirely different model of city making. And the thing is, when you have a 200-foot block city, you can be like a 2-lane city. Like Portland's streets average about 2 lanes, because there's a lot of one-laners and then some bigger streets. They have a lot of one-way streets. Salt Lake City's 600-foot blocks average 5 to 6 lanes. And this is what it's like crossing a street in Salt Lake City. They give you flags to wave, so you won't be run down. This was a study done. I can finally use it in California. It's 24 different California cities. I showed this all over. And if you look at near the bottom, or the middle, the average block size, as you double the average block size of your city, you about quadruple the number of non-highway fatal crashes. So clearly small blocks are better. Anything you can do to keep your block small, like you see in your downtown, is really important. Here's your initial plan, lovely plan by the Olmsteds, the most famous landscape architecture city planning firm in history, based in Brookline, Massachusetts, where I make my home and office, and it's with no small amount of pride. Or when someone says, "Where do you work?" I don't say Boston, I say Brookline, because that's where the Olmsteds had their firm. And this is really an exquisite plan. It's fun the way that it rotates 45 degrees, but what really makes it special is just the small blocks, the mid-block alleys that allow you to put all the ugly stuff off the street, right? And this very porous network, and no one street has to be very big. And by the way, the lesson then of small blocks is don't chop them up. Don't consolidate them. Don't superblock, and don't snip your connections. And you have snipped one connection, and I would argue that was a mistake, but you know where it is. It's the street that used to head towards the train depot, which doesn't reach the train depot anymore. Anything you do that limits the porousness of the street network, you're limiting the flow and the energy in that area. And successful downtowns are very porous. So I'm not saying open it back up, but that's an indication of the sort of thing you shouldn't be doing more of. And then here you are next to Portland. Now Portland's a real extreme, so your blocks are larger than Portland, but your blocks are perfectly fine and small, and that's what we call good bones. So walkability is eminently possible and already exists in this part of the downtown. And then you look to the east and you see the larger block model that fails in several ways. One is that the blocks are very big, but the other is how the streets are lined, and we'll talk, or lined or not lined by buildings, and we'll talk about that as well. But when you look at the downtown plan and you see certain areas where the blocks get really big and that porous network of streets ends, those are effectively areas where people will not make the choice to walk. And so you've actually created a moat situation around your downtown core. And where the blue is here is essentially places where pedestrian activity won't continue beyond. So it limits the opportunity for your downtown center, unless some major changes are made, which are possible to make but expensive to make in the layout of buildings and blocks. Because it feels like this, right? When you're in those areas and the buildings are floating in the middle of the block and they aren't lining the street and the blocks are huge, this is the experience of being in that space. And so you're not going to cross that space. And in fact, it's okay, this is another city, right? To the right, we don't need them. But it cuts off the whole eastern part past the lovely hotel I'm staying in. So that's the first thing, small blocks. Fewer lanes, of course, is better. This is a highway, but it applies to cities too. And we're always looking for opportunities to reduce the number of lanes. Now, in an environment where there's politics, like every American city, you can't generally take away lanes on streets that are congested, and most of your streets are, right? But you look for places where it's possible. And here's a great little trick that's happened in a lot of places in California called the 4-to-3 road diet. This is the road that you begin with. This is the road you end up with. 4-lane roads are extremely dangerous, and they're also inefficient because, the fast lane is also the turning lane. The turning lane is also the fast lane. You can get hit, but also there's a lot of pulse traffic that happens that causes jams. And so no one's surprised that when you do this, when you remove one lane and create a center turn lane that's shared, right, that accidents drop precipitously. Here's one study of one that was done in Florida. But the shock is, and here's a list of 23 of them that my colleagues studied. that the number of car trips does not go down. So it's a win-win-win. You're losing a lane, but you're not losing any capacity on the street. You're making it a lot safer. And then, of course, what do you do with that extra lane? And as you saw in the image, it can be bike lanes, it can be parking, but it allows you to do something else with that asphalt. And so we found one of those, right? This is 213, is that right? 213th. And it's a perfect classic 44-foot wide 4-laner ready to go tomorrow with just paint. Just paint, and you can make this a much safer and no less capacious street, if that's a word. So next is the lanes themselves, right? We've limited the lanes to no more than we need. Andre Stwani used to show this slide, and he'd say, the typical road to the typical subdivision in the United States is wide enough to allow you to observe the curvature of the earth. And it's true because our standards have been changing. So here's a subdivision from the 60s, and here's a subdivision from the 80s. Same height of airplane, and look at the width of the road, right? 60s, 80s. 60s, 80s. The standards just get wider and wider. This is my old street in South Beach in Miami. It wasn't draining properly, so they had to rebuild it. The new standard kicked in, and we lost our street trees and half our sidewalk because of this new standard when it was working perfectly well before. The data makes it very clear that wider lanes are faster lanes. We know intuitively a 12-foot lane is a highway lane. It's a 70-mile-an-hour lane. A 10-foot lane is an urban lane. It's more of a 40-mile-an-hour lane or less. Here's one of the studies that shows how speeds increase as lanes get wider. There are lots of studies like this. They're not questioned. And intuitively, we know this, right? And we're often fighting if we have an opportunity for narrower streets near our homes so that our children can be safer. We've certainly learned this developing new neighborhoods. It's almost always against the law to create new streets like this. We designed this one for Vince Graham, who's a developer outside of Charleston. He's a very good public speaker. He goes to conferences. This is a two-way street. You have these. I'll show you some. And he shows this narrow right-of-way, and he reminds us of this famous philosopher who said, "Broad is the road that leads to destruction. Narrow is the road that leads to life." And it's true. And you have these. You have one of these right downtown. It's a yield street. It's called a yield street. It's narrow lanes. And of course, your best residential neighborhoods west of downtown have these lovely narrow roads, which I'm curious to know if it's legal for you to build any more. But most of our communities that are older have them. But that's a residential street in which you don't have a lot of traffic. In a downtown street with a ton of traffic, 10 feet used to be the standard, and again is the standard. And we all did a dance for joy when the National Association of City Transportation Officials finally came out and said 10 feet is perfectly appropriate in an urban setting. And you can't tell us it's not appropriate here because you have some. So even though some of your streets, as I'll show you, have wider lanes, typically 11 feet, this is, I showed it to you before. It's the one just south of downtown in front of the high school. Carson. Carson actually has a number of 10-foot lanes in it. So don't let anyone tell you that you can't do 10-foot lanes here in Torrance. And then you have this amazing street that's right by my hotel, Mullen. And I don't know what happened, but this is a 2-lane street with 2 parked cars, so it should probably be 36 feet wide, and it's 50 feet wide. And then the corner radius, the tighter the radius, the slower the cars go around the turn, and the bigger the radius of the turn, the more speeding there is, and the harder it is to cross. And crossing this street is terrifying. It has a 40-foot radius, which I think is some sort of record, so congratulations on that. But you look at this street and you see just like a wide street. I see what's probably a public works manual that you need to fix. Like I'm not being funny. I mean, most cities I go to have a public works manual that's 10 or 30 years old that is based on obsolete criteria of speeding cars at the expense of pedestrians. So let Mullen be a lesson for you. So in most cities I work, we do a lane width inventory, and we see where can we find some space, and I'll show you some in a bit. Cycling, which I've not observed any of in Torrance, we like to say in planning, it's the largest revolution currently underway in some American cities. And in many it's not, right? But this is Portland, Oregon. where they spent $60 million over 30 years, so only a couple million a year, but they spent $60 million on bike infrastructure, and they went from biking a little bit more than most people to biking 15 times as much as most places. And my friend Tom Brennan, I asked him to send me some slides of the bike commute in Portland, and he sent me these. I said, was this bike to work day? He said, no, this is Tuesday in Portland. And so, you know, cities are doing it now all over, Pittsburgh and Chicago, and this is the gold standard. This is the protected bike lane. This is how you generate a cycling population, by making safe bike lanes where the parallel parking is pulled off the curb, right? And the bike lanes are protected by a lane of parked cars. And here's one that they built in New York. And when they changed this 3-laner to a 2-laner on Prospect Park in New York, the number of cyclists, of course, tripled. Speeding went from 75% to 17%. Injury crashes to all users, mostly drivers, dropped 63%. And then strangely, the road handles just as many cars as before. Because it was New York City, they were just speeding from red light to red light. And now they're just traveling at a more reasonable pace. Now, this being New York, of course, there was a 5-year drawn-out lawsuit, but eventually the bike-hating NIMBY trolls grudgingly surrendered to reality. And I show this slide mostly just to contrast it with this slide, and to say, you know, if you've got a street that's too wide, and I'll show you this, if you've got a street that's too wide, putting a bike lane in it will make it safer. But wouldn't you much rather have your daughter here than, you know, than in the door zone, right? And if you don't protect the bike lane, people put stuff in it. But they put UPS trucks in it, they put Ubers in it, right? I don't know how this happened, but the protected bike lane is a safe bike lane because it's actually still there when you're trying to use it. So people think of this, you know, they think of cyclists, they think of this, the mammal, the middle-aged male in Lycra. But in fact, this is your target audience. This is what the cities want to attract. This is what the tech workforce, right? The tech workforce wants to see more of. These were the only cyclists I saw in Torrance. And I won't make a big deal out of it, but I will just repeat that bicycle population is a function of bicycle investment. It's that simple. Culture matters a little. Weather matters a little. You've got amazing weather. Topography matters a little. You've got amazing topography. All you're missing is the investment. Okay? Parallel parking. Essential barrier of steel that protects the curb from moving vehicles. If you don't have parallel parking, you probably aren't going to feel comfortable on a street. This is happy hour in Fort Lauderdale. You'll notice you can park on the left and not on the right. Very happy on the left, not so happy on the right. No one wants to sit or walk or stand 5 feet from cars going 30, 40 miles an hour. So that parallel parking is really important. Here's an artist's rendition of what it feels like without the parallel parking. And of course, all your key downtown streets in the heart of the city are wonderfully parked. And I'm sorry, I say parallel parking, but any form of curb parking will provide you that nice outcome to protect it. It was so safe that a squirrel passed in front of me when I was taking this picture. And then there's this. Again, we're back on 213th, my whipping boy tonight, which has no parking. And then, is this like a South Bay thing? The trees are on the wrong side of the sidewalk. Like, I've never seen that anywhere else. Is that just here, or is it a California thing? I haven't seen it elsewhere in California. But for good measure, just in case you're not intimidated enough, we'll poke your eyes out while you're walking down the street. So, you know, that's this condition, and we know how to fix it. But your gem streets, your wonderful downtown core streets, are Post, Sartori, Marcelina, and El Prado, and you know them, and they're really ideal for walking around. The cars all go slow, because why? Because they might hit a car pulling out, because they might find a parking space, right? And it's nice and tight, and they're really just great. And then, of course, El Prado, with its wonderful Prado at the L end, is really something special. And then you have the other streets, not so special. They just have a lot of lanes, and maybe the lanes are too wide. Torrance, and then Cabrillo. Yeah, Cabrillo is a real interesting animal. We'll talk about it. And then, of course, where they meet is just the great churn, and needs some work. But and then also the one I can never remember, Johnny Carson. But here's an opportunity, which is Cravens. And Cravens is a street that should be 36 feet wide, 10, 10, 8, 8. But it's 45 feet wide. So actually you could put 2 bike lanes in this tomorrow and just make it a safer street for everybody. And then there's Cabrillo, which is just weird. It's like, it's two 2-lane one-way streets next to each other with trees in the middle. And 2-lane one-way streets actually don't feel safe. Cars jockey. And I have to say, I don't think there's too much speeding on this street, but what's fascinating is it's less than 20,000 cars per day. What that means is that that car count works perfectly well with one of those 3-lane roads that I showed you. And by the way, those 3-laners, the classic American road diet, you can put a median where there's no left turns. The left lane isn't needed, so you can actually have median trees in between intersections. So it's a beautiful, calm street, 1 lane in each direction, plus turns and intersections. And so this street's also kind of run down, right? It doesn't have any trees in the sidewalks. The sidewalks are kind of broken up. This would be a good street to rebuild, and perhaps rebuild it to a 3-lane standard. Now, let's look at the great opportunity that I saw, which was Torrance. And the reason why Torrance is a great opportunity is because not only is it a ton of lanes, which the traffic counts tell you need if you don't want to reduce the capacity, which some cities do, but I doubt you would want to because no one really likes that idea. But it's 76 feet wide, and it should be closer to 66 feet wide. What you've got, I don't know if you can read this, but you've got lanes that are, you've got a 12, 11-foot, 13-foot lanes in this street. So these lanes are larger than the 10-foot standard that you could have. And by the way, sometimes bus agencies demand 11-foot lanes, but that makes sense if a street is very constricted and there's no other lanes, but there's plenty of lanes here for people to jockey, and 10 feet's fine for all the lanes. So one thing you could do, if you make the lanes the right width, instead of having essentially non-existent 3-foot bike lanes, you could have fully 6-foot bike lanes. But because the street is pretty high speed and not that safe, it probably makes sense. Do you see what I'm showing here? Consolidating a 2-way protected lane on one side of the street. It's just an idea, right? I did this in 5 minutes. But the point is, for a street of this velocity, it probably makes sense to have the bikes more protected. So this is just an example of how the extra, not extra lanes, but the extra width in the lanes of that street is a real opportunity. Okay? So that was the big part of the talk. We're going to finish up quickly now with the comfortable walk and the interesting walk. The comfortable walk is a little bit counterintuitive because we all kind of like wide open spaces and climbing mountains and getting long views. But in fact, the evolutionary biologists tell us that all animals, humans among them, are simultaneously seeking prospect and refuge. You want to be able to see your predators before they attack you, and you want to feel that your flanks are covered from attack. And if you don't feel that your flanks are covered, you don't feel safe. And so what does that? A good street edge, a street that has some height to it, buildings that enclose spaces, and actually you want your outdoor public spaces to feel like outdoor living rooms. And so, you know, we urban designers have been talking about this for a long time. What's the ideal shape? 1-to-1 there is the Renaissance ideal. Beyond 6-to-1, even in the Renaissance they wrote that beyond 6-to-1 you no longer feel enclosed. So, you know, 1-to-6, Salzburg can be perfect heaven. And then, of course, the opposite of Salzburg is Houston. But this is an old picture of Houston. Forgive me if you're from Houston, they're looking a lot better right now. But the message of this slide is very important, which is that it's typically the surface parking lot that's eroding that street edge and making it not work. So the best streets downtown, you know, have some taller buildings, but also trees, right, really help. And then the streets you don't want to walk on are these ones that we talked about that have the buildings kind of floating in the parking lots, and it's the parking lots lining the edges of the streets and not the buildings lining the edges of the streets. And then finally, you know, even if a space is comfortable, it also needs to be interesting. We humans are among the social primates. Nothing interests us more than other humans. We want signs of humanity, or we actually just get bored and stop walking. I talked about how 1-to-1 was the Renaissance ideal. This is 1-to-1. This is in Grand Rapids, which has quite a walkable downtown, but not this street, which no one really wants to be on, which connects the 2 good hotels in downtown Grand Rapids. But one side of the street is a exposed parking deck, and the other side is a conference facility that was apparently designed in admiration for that parking deck. It's just, you know, it's boring. It's just too boring. Mayor Riley in Charleston taught us that it only takes 20 feet of building, of inhabited edge, to hide, you know, 200 feet of parking. Here's one that was built in South Beach in Miami. I call it the Chia Pet Garage. But, you know, the active street edge hiding the parking. And then here's something I found in your historical documents online, a building that was designed for that street, for Cravens. And it was originally going to look like the bottom, and then the design was changed to look like the one on the top without the garage lining the edge behind a wall, but with shops lining the edge. And see how they've brilliantly located the parking right in the middle? That's how you put parking in buildings without eroding the edge of your street. So people understand that now, and it's really a question of whether your codes are requiring that to happen. So finally, blank walls are never good. Places, you know, connect to places. Often there's a gap. And, you know, I used to work at the National Endowment for the Arts. We funded a lot of art. And I always say that public art should play a remedial effect. It should have a remedial impact, which is you need to remedy some spaces because they're just blank walls that are dull. And that's why I love investments in murals. And a lot of cities like Philadelphia have huge mural programs to you know, work on the sore spots. This is an American example. This is the European version. But, you know, take care of it, keep it neat. And that's the whole list. So you have to do all four. You have to do all four of these things is unfortunately what I'm saying. And that's why it helps to focus, but also to acknowledge. When I talk about a more walkable Torrance, I'm not talking about all of Torrance. And those of you who want to keep driving and living in the parts beyond the downtown core, which have grown up almost entirely around the automobile, that kind of is your future, because the bones are the wrong bones for walkability. But you have a downtown core that belongs to everybody. Right? I don't care where you live in Torrance or even outside of Torrance. The downtown is everybody's. People know that it's public space, and it's all of ours, at least yours. And so you can lift the whole city by having just a small part of it that provides this quality of life that so many people are hoping to enjoy. Let me finish by just sharing a few resources. I am signing books in the back. If you want to convince yourself or someone else about walkability, then this is the best book. However, if you're doing the work, that's why I wrote this new book. That's much more of a manual, much more how-to, and it's a lot more technical. So you can choose which one is better for you. I mentioned Suburban Nation, the book that I learned really from my mentors. And then the TED Talks. There's also a TED Talk which is like the one I gave tonight. So if you want to share a short version of what will, I guess, be recorded and be a long version, this is only 15 minutes long, and you can find them at my name under TED. I teach a course every year. I'm about to do this in June. I know it's a long way, but I teach a 2-day class at Harvard that anyone can join. It's this year, I believe it's the 21st and 22nd of June, and it's Harvard, so it's not cheap, but honestly, when you're done, you get a piece of paper that makes it look like you graduated from Harvard. So it's really worth it. And then finally, all these resources and more, all you need to remember if you're interested in any of this stuff is just go to my website, which is myname.com, and you will hopefully find an easy way around. So thank you so much for your kind attention. I look forward to the discussion with you all.
Okay, well, DJ Ozzy puts the chairs on the stage up here and eventually takes away the podium. We've got some people walking around with the index cards for the audience members to put their questions. We've got a few already. I don't know about you guys, but hearing about this stuff and reading Jeff's book and hearing Andy's presentation, it just blows me away. But by a show of hands, how many people think that Old Torrance has a lot more potential than what it's realizing? Just about everybody in the room. That's right. And the last time we tried any revitalization effort for Old Torrance was about 40 years ago, and it didn't work that well, obviously. So I see it, and I just think it's such a gem, and I'm just thrilled to have people like this come to our city and share their wealth of expertise with us so that we can learn from it and find a solution that works for us. Let's see here. All right. Gonna head up to the stage and take some questions from the audience. Okay, so the first one is actually not a question, it's a comment, but a member of the audience says, happy to see a mention of arts and culture in Andy's presentation, and hope that Torrance will realize the role that arts can play. Pasadena has public art ordinances as well as strong historic preservation, and we need to reference STEAM, not just STEM. So, hearing your presentations, one of the questions I'm left with is if you're a member of the audience here tonight or somebody watching this on YouTube later, your average resident, what is it that they can do to best harness their energy and move Torrance forward and enact this vision of a more vitalized old Torrance and technology businesses in our city?
So first of all, it's always great to hear Jeff's. I have had your books for many years, and I'll confess, as somebody who lives in Pasadena, I walk 3 days a week. I don't start my car. I walk to City Hall. I walk to my office. I walk to my coffee shop. My kids have walked to school since they were in kindergarten. And I got to tell you, if you can figure out how to bring a walkable city to Southern California, your community will be one of the finest places in the world. And I live that, and I think you have, certainly from Jeff's perspective, the bones to do that. But I think economic vitality, which is the thing I think about. I remember when the city of Pasadena declared an area to be the biotech corridor. In 30 years, nothing happened. And this is, once again, declaring economic vitality and saying you want to have it there is a fool's errand. You have to figure out who are the people you want to attract, what you have to offer them, and it's really a grassroots movement where the city needs to support that. But I think it's a imperative that it become a collaboration with the existing business community, folks like the Chamber of Commerce, and as Jeff says, people who are talented want to have quality of life, and I think Walkable City is definitely what the next generation, and maybe it makes me feel young because I like walking around. Typical week, I'll walk 30 miles.
So the first thing is just show up. Planning in the U.S. suffers from what I would call a tragedy of the commons, which is that generally communities want to become more walkable, they want to become more transit served, they want to have more attainable housing, they want all the things that make them complete, but they don't necessarily want them next to their homes. And so the folks who show up at public meetings are often the ones who are personally affected by a decision which is good for the city, but maybe actually bad for them. They might be right that something that's being proposed is impacting their property in a way that they have reason to be concerned about. But typically in public meetings about urban change, those are the only people who show up. And the people who are generalists, who have a real gusto for improving their city, because they're not personally affected in the same way, they don't come. So it's the great kind of challenge of planning, I think, in the 21st century, is we've made it very democratic, but the people who show up are not a representation of the community. So we need you all to show up, particularly if you care about making places better.
It's interesting because in talking about this in the community, there have been some people that said, "Oh, we don't want a walkable city. We don't want to give up our cars," and that's not what this is about. 99% of Torrance is not walkable so much, and we've got the 1% that is, and it's pretty clear to me anyway that that's the future, and that's what our new generations want. If you look at downtown LA 10, 15 years ago versus now, it's a huge resurgence, and even old Pasadena, all these other cities that are now walkable and thriving. So I think there definitely is a space for 1% of Torrance to be walkable.
I think it's closer to 5 to 10% geographically. It's significant, but it is very much the minority.
Next question is, I have a daughter graduating from USC, fight on, in 2 weeks with a major in electrical engineering. As someone who wants to live and work in Southern California, what advice can I give her as a mother?
So I was sitting at a dinner a few months ago with the CEOs of 10 successful tech companies in Southern California. And we educate people. Here's a great example. Engineer from USC. And what we find is that the organizations like Apple and Facebook, they come down here and steal our talent. And because we don't do a good job telling our stories of incredible innovation companies, and we've let Silicon Valley hijack that narrative. And I think people who have great educations want great jobs. And I think all of us need to start telling that story so we can keep our talent here. And we need to have the facilities and the quality of life, frankly, that competes with places like Seattle or Portland. And I think these types of efforts of building attractive urban or semi-urban communities will resonate with those recent graduates. So I think we have the materials. It's just a question of being strategic and committing ourselves to moving our cities in this direction, but also being a little bit more vocal about what's going on here and celebrating it.
So question for Andy again. All this is good if you want great technology companies, but I'm not sure I want great technology companies because this leads to gentrification, displacement, loss of an airport like in Santa Monica. How do you feel about that, and how do you address that?
I mean, these can be overdone. That's why I pointed out to the challenge of Silicon Valley. So I think, as Jeff just mentioned, that we're not talking about transforming and moving 100% of the city and redoing it. I think diversity in our community is critical. I think you can be oversaturated in any one area. So I think it's a question of really having a balanced community. I spent time in Irvine, and they're having an incredible difficult time attracting the next generation. They're on their way to becoming Hawaii because they can't figure out how to keep that balance of attracting young people. And they need you, Jeff, down there because that was built in the 70s, and it's kind of very functionally separated. So the goal here is not to all or nothing. It's like we're not going to turn every street to a bike street, but it's a question of having balance and having young people who can bring vitality, and having tech jobs and having traditional jobs. Because I think what's most compelling about Southern California is the diversity of what's going on here, and I would be wildly against massive transformation in any one direction.
Well, on that note, turning this over to Jeff, I read your book, Walkable City, and in it there was an example of two different cities. One that was laid out in a very suburban way, and they were hoping to attract tech companies, and I remember they weren't very successful at attracting talent because of the way it was laid out. And then one city that was laid out in a way where they were successful attracting talent. Maybe you can elaborate on that example and explain how that pertains to us.
Sure, that was my book. Just kidding. Well, I believe I was quoting Chris Lineberger, who used to run Robert Charles Lester Company. He's like one of the leading real estate advisors in the U.S. And he was actually, as what he's become, which is a Brookings economic development expert. the way he laid it out is that, you know, the old school economic development strategies of creating a biotech, and I mean, actually, this would be good for you to respond to, creating a biotech cluster or an aeronautical cluster or some other flavor of the week, or going out and subsidizing some corporation to come to your city and bring jobs that way, has fallen out of favor. And what cities are doing much more right now is, as I alluded to earlier, trying to become the sort of places where people want to spend their time, because of the flexibility that talent has in that regard. Does that get any elaboration?
When the more expensive the talent is, the more quality. You know, you're competing on the margin. Like, it's not just the paycheck, and so the quality of life and the livability and the experience they want is a critical recruiting tool. And I think, you know, giving a tax break to the company in a place where talent doesn't want to be, because you have an empty office park, doesn't get the job done. Right? If you're looking for, you know, maybe hiring and bringing an organization where they're not fighting for talent in the same way, you probably could find a use. But if you're really in the high-tech world and, you know, biotech, med tech, that talent is the most important ingredient. And that's why you have, you know, chefs coming into offices and bikes there and bring your pet, because they're really looking for every lever possible to get talent. And that's why WeWork's taken off. I mean, it's an amenities driven, and they're in great locations. So the tax subsidy, I think, in this kind of that real high echelon of high tech, doesn't change the opportunity to deliver what the workforce is looking for.
And I remember now from the book the specific story, which was that a large manufacturer of sporting goods in Grand Rapids, Michigan, was in suburban Grand Rapids, and they couldn't retain any talent. And the reason that the polling found they couldn't retain talent is because the spouses weren't making friends. And there weren't the chance encounters on the street that you might have in a more urban environment that allowed friendships to form. And talent would not stay because their spouses didn't want to stay. Then they opened an innovation hub right smack dab in downtown Grand Rapids and turned that around.
Next question is, I love the idea of a walkable Torrance. Some cities like Santa Monica and Pasadena seem to work because there's a greater transportation infrastructure that is efficient. Is Torrance planning for that? I can actually take that one. Right now you may have noticed some green fencing along Crenshaw Boulevard around 208th, just north of Maricopa and south of the refinery there. We're building a regional transit center there that should be open in the not too far future. And that's really going to help our transit situation down here in the South Bay. Also, connecting to that is the Green Line in the future, and that's set to happen before the Olympics in 2028. I know it sounds like a long way off, but I think that's going to be a game changer at connecting us to the rest of Los Angeles. And we're also, the City Council here in Torrance is working to secure some federal funding, a federal grant, for an electric rubber-wheeled trolley circulator that would connect that regional transit center to Old Torrance, and I think also the Del Amo Fashion Center. So we do have transportation plans in the work, and we're actively working towards those. I think we've got a former city employee that asked this question that wasn't too happy with their job. How often do city codes and/or local regulations stand in the way of creating more walkable cities? Can cities reform their laws?
So I mean, that was kind of the big second discovery of the new urbanists, you know, my mentors. The first was that we'd been designing communities all wrong for about 50 years. The second was that when you designed them right and went into any city or county in the U.S. and found the best spot, you know, where is it? Okay, we happen to be in Cleveland. You know, what's the best neighborhood if we're making a new neighborhood in the Cleveland area? Okay, let's go see Shaker Heights. Like, people love to live in Shaker Heights. Or, you know, let's check out Beverly Hills. Everyone wants to be, who knows what it might be. But in each region, you'd go and you'd say, okay, we're making a new development, and we've found the best model that you all love. It's your favorite thing in this city. And guess what? It's completely illegal to do it anymore. For all the, and I mentioned a lot of the factors, the mixing of the uses, the heights of the buildings, the setbacks. Typical, at least until recently, because there's been a great revolution in this way, but the typical historic neighborhood in the U.S., if you wanted to build a new house in that historic neighborhood, you probably had to set it back different from all its neighbors, because there were setback requirements that didn't pay attention to the historic setbacks. Sometimes you would have to combine two lots in order to put a house down, because a house wouldn't fit on an old lot anymore. So the answer is yes. I mean, that's been the great, the great second act of work in planning, in new urban planning, has been to not only to modify existing codes, but to create a whole new framework of codes that are called form-based codes that allow this sort of historically precedented placemaking to happen again.
So in Pasadena, we actually have a different problem. So you may know Stefanos Palazoides, who chaired New Urbanism, and we also have complete streets kind of frameworks and form-based codes. So a lot of the tools we have adopted, and we actually find that the concept of change is uncomfortable for the residents. They're used to having, streets of a certain size, parkways of a certain size, mixed use and having scale around transit, where they're used to 2- and 3-story buildings. We're building 5- and 6-story buildings, which, you mentioned this idea of having living, mixed use and kind of residential above commercial is really where we're going. I think part of this is a little bit of, to this group here, if you want to change, some of it's going to be uncomfortable because it's just not what we're used to. So the planners need to do their work, but it does need to be a collaboration. There needs to be an education process. And Tim, congratulations to you for bringing someone like Jeff to kind of set the framework, because it needs to be not just led by the city, but the community needs to be behind you.
And I would add that the most controversial things you find typically are when bike lanes replace driving lanes, which is why I almost never do that. Like, I'll find a way. Like, the only time I'll typically attempt that is if it's a 4-to-3, where I can demonstrate, as I showed you, that the throughput, the volume will not drop. And then reducing parking requirements, which many cities are doing, because actually people want to park less and drive less and walk more, and to allow for affordability. Reducing parking requirements has had mixed results in its neighborhoods, particularly where people park on street currently, and they're afraid they're going to lose that capacity through competition, right, with someone else. So often, yeah, I mean, the rules are embraced and hard to change sometimes, but many of them aren't.
I think Andy actually inadvertently answered this question here, and we do have a lot of questions here, but I think we have time for 2 more. And I think you answered this question, which was you didn't fully address the infrastructure part that was needed to accommodate the increase of people in Pasadena, such as housing and traffic and so on. So I think you covered that a little bit. But like I said earlier, the last time any kind of revitalization effort was tackled in Old Torrance was 40 years ago. And whatever was done then didn't work. And we know that the status quo is not working. So I'm not afraid to say that I think the way forward is to have some increased housing in there. Now the question arises, how much? I'm not exactly in favor of high density housing. I grew up in a small city of 30,000 people, and I don't think that's Torrance. But I think some additional housing is necessary. I sat out for coffee on the street a couple months ago, and in the hour I was having coffee out there, there were 6 people that walked by at 9 a.m. on a weekday. And that's not a recipe for a successful downtown area. And that actually kind of leads to my next question here is, cities, to take on an effort like this, we're going to have to spend some money. What kind of return on investment have you seen in other cities that have invested in their downtown areas?
Oh boy, I wish I had a copy of my book, which is back there, to read to you what happened in Lancaster, California. Do you know that story? It was a Moulin Polizades design. But, I mean, they spent like $8 million redoing their Main Street and generated like $300 million in increased revenue over time from just making it from a placeless, 5-lane nowhere into a neat little Main Street that almost feels like a plaza. But you're more of a numbers guy than me, Andy. I don't know if you... I'm passing the baton.
Sure. Can we bring up the Excel spreadsheet I brought? That's a joke. I think two great examples. You mentioned Old Town Pasadena. By the way, we put in parking there, and we restored the historic stock to be retail, and it's worked incredibly well. I mean, the tax increment was off the chart, and we now have some other business improvement districts. And the big play there was the centralized parking, because retail needs parking which was not built in historic buildings. And so the city took advantage of the community development dollars, which don't exist anymore. So the funding strategies in California are not as robust as they were 25 years ago. So it's more challenging to do those types of projects. We have another group around the Playhouse, which is the state's historic theater, happens to be in Pasadena, and they're working on economic development strategy. And a lot of the same people who were at the time much younger involved in the old Pasadena effort talked about parking. And then there are no dollars at the state level, and they came to the city and they said, we think we need parking. And Tim, this could be your conversation. We're like, we don't think long-term parking is a good investment, because we would have to bond parking structures. And you think about taking out a 30-year bond, and I can tell you my 17-year-old kid could have had his license 2 years ago, and he's either walking, skateboarding, or doing ride sharing. So you have to ask your question of what the return horizon is. So we've told that group that we're not going to invest in parking. And interestingly enough, they hired a very prominent urban planner, not Jeff, but another one, to work on their strategy. And not only did they not want parking, they're now taking a parking lot and creating behind the Playhouse an outdoor theater to engage the community, because they thought about the horizon and how people are going to move, and that's now part of their 10 or 20-year plan. So my point is, strategies for activating communities change with time and behavior. And just what worked 20, 30 years ago, it may not work today because people's behavior change. And certainly the access to financing changes over time. I mentioned this earlier. We really had this great idea for economic development around a biotech corridor, and all these people bought property, and we couldn't get the companies because we didn't figure out how to direct the talent. Right? It's like the talent in the research, there needs to be a catalyst, and the really point of my conversation is figure out what your catalyst is, figure out what your hook's going to be. Having sidewalks are nice and walkability is nice, but what is going to differentiate Torrance? Who is the population you're targeting? What's special about your community, and who is your target audience for that?
If I could be a little helpful, maybe. It seems like one of the biggest questions you're facing if you talk to folks downtown. It's funny, we were sitting around a table talking about a bunch of different things, and someone said, whenever we have talks like this, all we end up doing is talking about parking. And then we spent the next half hour talking about parking. And it does seem like the biggest question you maybe are facing is whether it's worth investing in a significant increase in the amount of parking supply that you have in your downtown, perhaps building a structure somewhere. I would say that I can't say with any confidence which way that needle should tilt, but I can say very confidently that long before you think about doing that, you should investigate and invest in managing the parking that you have. You have absolutely zero management happening in terms of people knowing where to park, where availability is. You've got a lower story to that underground parking deck that no one uses because it doesn't feel safe, because it's not properly monitored, and it needs some design tweaks so that people can get out after they get in. There's little things like that could be fixed rather inexpensively, but mostly managed better, so that you're utilizing the parking you have efficiently before you ask this question of, do we need to build more parking?
Andy, you mentioned the example of your child not driving and doing ride sharing and all the things that the young people are doing. There was actually a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of weeks ago about the trends for young people and driving, and And it used to be viewed as soon as you turned 16, you got your driver's license, and it was the ultimate symbol of freedom. And that's not just not the case anymore. Young people these days, borne out by statistics, have shown that young people who are increasingly mobile view the car as an anchor around their leg because of the car payment and all the money that they're pouring into it. Exactly. So the number of young people getting their license at the age of 16 is just dropping off precipitously. It's really interesting. We only have time for one last question, so I'll ask this. And I think you keep anticipating these questions, Andy, because you touched on this a little bit about finding what sets Torrance apart. And this question is, within the South Bay, Torrance, Manhattan Beach, and El Segundo are very different, but should we find a joint story or a mission? And I think that also touches on your nodes that you were talking about.
I can't answer that question because I don't know enough, but I do think when you do that reflection, it's better to be part of a bigger, stronger story than it is to go it alone. In some cases, you're big enough and strong enough on your own. So I think what you really want is success and change. And that's why I say, don't tell yourself a story you want to hear. Sometimes give yourself some tough love. What is the story, and are you part of something that's more of a sub-regional story? And by that, maybe that starts addressing some of your transportation issues, right? Don't think of yourself as part of a connected community. So I don't know what the answer is, but I certainly know what the question is. I think it's worth exploring that. Certainly Manhattan Beach has seen a lot of revitalization. El Segundo, I got to tell you, with the commercialization of space, the aerospace legacy of Southern California will be revisited in the next decade. SpaceX is here. I know 6 other space companies that will be multi-billion-dollar companies in Southern California. They're not going to be airplane-based. They'll be colonization of, it sounds crazy, but it will be taking commercial activities into space, and there's no reason that shouldn't find a home here in the South Bay.
I have no story except, I just get impressions of places when I go there, and some places feel more kind of hip and gritty, and others feel more corporate. But downtown Torrance to me just feels like a place to live. Like it feels like a place where as soon as more people start living there, a lot more people will start living there. It has the physical qualities of a place that's much more expensive. And I would actually invest in it if I had that capacity. Because it actually, you look at how places look and feel and how economically vibrant they are, and I see a disconnect. So I think there's tremendous potential. But you need more people. You need more people there.
Speaking of investment, did I tell you we're doing a fundraising drive? How many venture capitalists do we have out here in the audience? One to start with $6 million. Okay. I just want to thank the audience and our sponsors again for coming out on your weeknight. I know there's plenty of other things you could be doing, but you're engaged in the community, and I truly appreciate that. And this is part of a larger effort to move Torrance forward. And in fact, that's what I'm calling this campaign, is Torrance Forward. I think cities have a tendency to be very reactive in nature, and government in general. And I don't like to just sit back on our heels and wait for things to hit us and constantly be reacting. The most successful companies, and I think the most successful cities in the world, are proactive in their management, and that's the approach that I take to government personally. So that's why I wanted to, bring these 2 excellent speakers out to you to get this conversation started and move Torrance forward in a more positive direction. So thank you again for coming out, and thank you to our excellent speakers, Andy and Jeff. And Jeff's going to be in the back for his book signing.